Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony. I'm founder and CEO at SeedLegals. Years ago, I used to head up BBC iPlayer. Then I left, built a startup, sold it, built a startup, sold up, invested in a few, got tired of paying lawyers, built SeedLegals. We're about 160 people. About 1 in 3 of all first UK funding rounds are done on SeedLegals. Lots of option schemes, R&D tax credits, and more. But I talk to many, many founders, and as a founder myself, I see the pain points and I see often the problems with pitching, finding investors, and apart from the legals that we sort, hopefully, the issues about growing a team, finding a co-founder, what happens when things don't work. And I'm here to share all thoughts, answer all questions, and see how I can help and not pitch seed legals. Over to you.
Awesome. Okay, first question we're going to start out about is we have not talked that much about how much founders typically raise in the pre-seed round and what's the best way to calculate how much you need.
Okay, great question. So the firstly, I'm not a big fan of phrases like pre-seed and seed because it's
I
a
knew
bit
you were
all
going
over
to
the
say
show.
that.
What you want, so what you want to know, if you're on the call, and my understanding is that those on the call haven't raised yet. You're super early stage, and so you want to know what to do next. And I think that in everyone's mind is something like this. Well, fundraising is hard. I've heard I have to raise for 12 to 18 months runway. So how much do I need? Well, I need to figure out how many people I need and then raise enough for that. And I think you always end up with 8 people. So like, let's say there are 2 founders and then I need 2 developers. Let's say I need a data person. I need a salesperson. I need a marketing person. And I need a designer, of course. So that's like 8. I think it always comes to 8. So then you go, well, let's say their salaries are 50K a year. So that's 400K a year. I have to raise for 18 months. So that's 600K I need. Awesome, 600K. I'll go raise 600K. And then so the next thing to note is at what valuation. So my data at SeedLegals shows that companies dilute a median of 15% in a funding round. So your goal is to raise and give away not much more, ideally not more than 15%, at least in your early funding rounds. If you are having an investor looking for 30% of your company, that's a bad thing because after a couple of rounds, as founders, you'll be minority shareholders in your own business. So if you're raising and diluting by 15%, the formula mathematically, you just multiply the amount that you want to raise by 5, which will give you the pre-money valuation for your round. So let's say you wanted to raise £200,000, multiply by 5, that's £1 million pre-money valuation. So your valuation after the round will be 1.2 million. The investors will own 200 out of 1.2, 1 in 6, near enough 15%. So you've now figured out I need 8 people I want to raise for, and that's 600K multiplied by 5, so 3 million pre-money valuation. And you head out to investors and you go, yep, I'm raising. They go, what's the valuation? You go, 3 million. And they go, awesome. And what's your revenue? You go, oh, I don't have any revenue. And they go, well, how many users do you have? And there you go, don't have any users. Well, can I see your product? Well, I haven't built it yet. So then they go, well, that's very nice. Come back later. So the come back later is a story of your life as a founder, because if you're raising a too high valuation or you're going to too late stage investors, principally VCs, they only invest once you've got revenue and traction, and you want to raise before that. So what you need to do is you need to raise a lot less initially to match the valuation that you can get. So you then realize raising at a 3 million valuation when you haven't built anything, unless you've got a great social media profile and you're amazing at storytelling, you're unlikely to get that in the UK or indeed Europe, maybe in the US, but not otherwise. So then you need to find something that's going to fit with the investor expectation. And so, raising 200K, now that the SEI's limit is 250K for your first raise is great. So now you've got kind of fit. All right, I want to raise 250K at a 1.2 million valuation. But still, finding 250K of investment is tough. You have to get all the investors together and find them. It's like a bus trip with everyone on the bus. It can only leave when the last person arrives, and you have to wait for everyone. But you didn't need 250K right now. If you had 50K, you could hire that designer and outsource the development and get the prototype built. So is there a way to raise before a funding round? And so the key message I've got is on SeedLegals, we've got the concept of agile fundraising. So in your mind, you want to do a funding round. But actually, the reality these days is that founders are raising before a funding round opportunistically from individual investors. And we use a seed fast. It's our name for an advanced subscription agreement. So funding round is we get a lot of people together, sign a term sheet, do a shareholders agreement, agree a valuation, everyone invests, signs all the documents, sends money, and you're away. But that's long and slow. And instead, you can go to individuals one at a time. So you meet someone at an event and they go, "Hey, I love what you're doing. Can I invest 10K?" And instead of saying, "Come back in December when I've got my funding round," you can say, "Yes, let me send you a seed fast." And a seed fast is kind of like an IOU for shares. So they say, "I will give you money now." And you say, "I will give you shares when I do my next funding round." Um, and to incentivize you to come in sooner, I will give you a 10 or 20% discount on the valuation the investors pay in the round. And by the way, if I don't do a funding round within 6 months, I'll give you shares based on a 2 million valuation or whatever you might expect your valuation to be in 6 months. And that's needed to make it SEIS compatible. So on SeedLegals, once upon a time, funding rounds were the way. And now 70% of investment, amazingly, is raised outside of a funding round, raising ahead of a round, doing a round, and then top up afterwards. So I hope that was a slightly long answer to the question, but maybe the short answer is the pattern I see for first funding rounds these days is the first rounds are usually sort of on the order of 200K or thereabouts. But what's happening is companies are raising maybe 50 or 70K of that in one by one investments beforehand so that they can use that money to get traction to justify a higher valuation later.
And that 60 and 70 is included in the 250 in the 250 figure. So
exactly. It converts
okay.
in the round. That's right. Yeah.
Got it. So I was just going to type in the chat about SEIS, but I'll say now, if you are planning to register for SEIS, actually, first of all, can you give a thumbs up on Zoom if you've already registered for SEIS? I want to gauge how much detail we should go into around SEIS. Okay, got a few. People. Okay, and so now do thumbs up if you're planning to register. Or I'll do a different reaction. I don't know. Just do any other reaction apart from the thumbs up if you're planning to raise or go through the SEIS approval process over the next 6 months or so. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll give a very quick overview of SEIS. So SEIS powers the UK startup economy. So SEIS, if you don't know it, is where angel investors, that's people investing personally, can claim a tax deduction of half the size of their investment amount. So if they invest 20K in your company, they can deduct 10K off this year's income tax, or they can backdate it. Not that everyone knows that, but it's a nice selling point. They can backdate it to their last year's income tax. And the limits have increased. So it used to be you could raise £150,000 SEIS for your company. It's now £250,000. So when you go to investors, if you can tell angel investors that, yes, I can give you SEIS, it's often the difference between, yes, I'm in and call me when you've got your, qualify. So in order to be able to tell investors, you can definitely offer them SEIS. Most companies will qualify. If you're doing energy or electricity generation or gas or farming, you can't, but in general, most startups will qualify for SEIS. But for investors to know for sure, you can get something called SEIS Advance Assurance, where you go to HMRC and you fill in a bunch of details and you have to provide evidence of some investor interest. Then HMRC give you a letter that goes, you qualify, we agree you qualify and confirm you qualify to offer your investors SEIS. And then you can tell investors that you've got your advance assurance. The advance assurance isn't legally required, but it's often the difference between I'm in and call me when you've got your advance assurance. So as soon as you've got some investor interest, it's usually worthwhile applying for your advance assurance. And based on the HMRC stats, we do 51% of all of them come through and are done on SeedLegals. So our goal is to make that a lot easier for you.
I know this question is going to come up for founders going through that process. Can you talk briefly about the financial forecasts and the business plans required for the SEIS approval process?
Right. Okay. So now you've got me on a mini rant about business plans. Okay. So,
well, it's such a bizarre thing that founders aren't doing nowadays. So I want to make sure we have that covered for when they go through that process.
Okay. It's a great point. So, there's a lot of discussion about whether early stage startups need a business plan or not. And lots of people go, it's a complete waste of time because you're making up all the numbers. And if an investor asks to see a detailed business plan, it's mental because you have really no idea how many people are going to buy your product, even what the product is. But I think a business plan is actually an excellent idea, a simple one, because it focuses your mind on your business actually becoming profitable, revenue generating. And if you can't figure out a business plan, it indicates a substantial problem. Everyone knows, I mean, any astute investor knows, and you should know that your business plan won't correspond to reality. It's a best guess. But if you can't model what your revenue and your profit and loss might be for the next few years, then that indicates a problem with the first move in your game of chess. There are no other moves afterwards planned. So, but at least when you do your SEIS Advance Assurance, HMRC asks for a 3 to 5 year business plan. That doesn't have to be a super complicated Excel spreadsheet. They're looking for 1 or 2 pages that have a graph that shows the growth year by year, the profit and loss. And the reason they're looking for it is to, this is taxpayer money that's getting used to fund your company's growth. And they want to make sure that it's a growth company. So if your P&L goes from sort of 0 to £1 million a year in like day one and then stays there, that indicates it's not really a growth company. You've got a guaranteed income, like you're a consultant or something. That's not what that money is for. If, on the other hand, I'm amused when I see business plans that after 5 years or even 3 years are showing like £200 million a year revenue. That's great, but you'd be like a FTSE 100 or 500 company. Twitter didn't have that rate of growth, so it's statistically unlikely. So what I like to see in a business plan is that the growth is maybe 3x or 5x year on year for the first year or two, then 3x and then 2x year on year. If your growth starts growing exponentially, something is probably wrong because very few companies do that. If your growth goes up and then plateaus, that often indicates that you've picked too small a market or you're not ambitious enough. So if you're doing bicycles in Bristol, that's great, but you're going to max out that market pretty quickly. So investors are going to go, you're showing £1 million a year revenue by year 3. That's great for you, but it's not an investable business for me. So all of which is to say is to have a business plan, I would say, that shows, at least £20 million a year, 10 to 20 million pounds a year revenue by year 5, which then makes it attractive for investors. If you are going to index ventures, they probably want to see more than that. If you're going to angel investors, that alone would give them a great return on investment.
A lot of follow-up questions. We'll wrap there for SEIS, but there are several big no-nos for SEIS, which are highlighted in the SeedLegals articles that we've linked in the startup book that you all have been sent. Things like making sure you don't issue EIS shares prior to SEIS. So make sure you take a thorough read of that. And then, yeah, those pages those web links are linked in an email that you've been sent previously. I want to move on to valuations. For this question, I guess won't apply to pre-seed, so we might have to start at like Series A and then we'll work our way back to pre-seed. But can you talk to me a little bit about growth multiples and what you see for like the 10 to 20 million that you mentioned when you're 5 years out and you're raising? What's a growth multiple that investors would put on at maybe like the Series A? And then what do you see at seed, assuming there's revenue? And then we'll end it by talking about how pre-seed valuations are done when you're pre-revenue.
Okay, that's quite a big
I know
question
that's such a
space.
poorly phrased question.
Let's see if we can focus it down to a few minutes. So, when you're starting off, it's just you, the wonderful faces on the call. There's no product, there's no revenue yet, there's no users yet, probably. So people are kind of betting on you, your team, and the concept. And of course, you can't easily put a number on that, but we'll get to that in a minute. But much later on, if all goes well, 5 years later, you're doing a few £1 million a year in revenue. It's increasing a certain amount year on year. And at that point, the model is proved. You've proved you can build a team. You've proved you can build a product. You've proved people want your products and will pay for it, and that you can scale and so on. So once you've done all of that, then actually you and the product and the team is actually less important in the investor's decision making. They just look at the numbers. I mean, if you're doing £100 million a year revenue and it's growing, 50% year on year, people just look at the spreadsheet and go, great, this is your valuation. I'm in. By the way, what do you guys do again? So the formula and what's important to investors will change. So if you start, later on at sort of Series A plus level, investors will take your rate of growth and your annual revenue and put a multiplier on it, depending on the rate of growth, to come up with a valuation. And as of a few years ago, when valuation multiples were higher, it might have been a 10 to 15 times annual revenue. So you're doing £1 million a year, your valuation is 10 to 15 million pounds. It's going to depend. If your revenue is growing flat, it might be a multiplier of 2 or 3. If your revenue is growing insanely fast, it might be a multiple of 20. But that's all changed in the last year with interest rates going up. The cost of capital is higher. Investors can earn money by leaving it in the bank, so yours has to be much more valuable. So we might be seeing multiples of like 6x or thereabout today. So if you're doing £1 million a year revenue, your VC investor might, start talking about a valuation of £6 million. Now, of course, that only applies once you've got revenue and, perhaps £100,000 or more in steady state revenue, and then you can start putting a multiplier on it. But before that, how do you work out what the revenue, what the valuation is? So here I joke, so you're going out for your first funding round, you have to come up with a valuation. You've got no revenue, you don't have a product, what you're going to pick. So my joke is, you can look at TechCrunch, those crazy US numbers, and take at least 1 0 off the end because it's not going to work in the UK. Or you can ask your accountant to value the company, and your accountant will go, well, do you have revenue? You go, no. Are you making a loss? You go, yes. Have you got any revenue coming up? You go, no. So they're going to go, why is the valuation more than 0? And by the way, I don't think you're a going concern. So that asking an accountant is useless because they'll value you based on past financials, whereas investors are valuing you based on future potential. So the other thing is you can try and find other like-for-like companies and what they fundraised at and their valuation. Often people say how much they raise, but not the valuation, so it's a bit more tricky. But, I think we've got some SeedLegals articles on benchmarks, but broadly, sort of that 5x the amount you want to raise is a good starting point. But of course, I've just shifted the problem space to then figure out how much to raise. But you may find broadly, pre-product, your valuation will be south of £1 million. Once you've built something, $1 million to 2. Once you've got users, perhaps 2 million plus. But let's see when you get there, and the pitch deck, and I'm sure there'll be a longer answer to that as well.
And then just to remind everyone, put your questions in the chat and we'll go to Q&A shortly. But can you talk a little bit to how, even at a pre-seed or seed stage, the valuation is going to depend whether you're a consumer good company or your B2B enterprise, and how it shifts depending on what sector or who your customer is?
Great question. So what investors like is they like businesses that will scale for a low additional cost per user. And the perfect example is a SaaS platform where, in theory, your scaling is unlimited by just paying AWS a bit more for hosting costs. Whereas a time and material business where you employ consultants and they each, people speak to the consultants, that has a very high cost per extra user. You have to keep hiring more people. Or if you're selling physical goods, obviously there's cost per good and there's a margin and so on. But the clean thing that fuels, the entire startup ecosystem from the start was technology and platforms that are enabling things that people did manually before. So your classic is a B2B fintech where you're going to have some products or service that, revolutionizes some existing way of working that was manual and now has a platform to it. And obviously, SeedLegals is in that territory, except that we are not just pure platform, we're people as well, because we know our customers want to talk to a human and ask them questions as well. So of course, that's very nice if you're a pure B2B SaaS business, but many people aren't. I see on SeedLegals, pizza, drones, beer, sanitary products, whatever it might be. So you are then going to have to figure out what's going to make sense in your area. Many investors don't like hardware products because they know that hardware is capital intensive and you can spend a lot of money on the hardware and only and iterating and so on is slow. Some specialize in med tech, but people know that any medical products often cost millions and takes years to get all the approvals. So different spaces have got different pain points. And of course, anything with AI these days is super hot, except that bubble might be sort of already a bit over because investors look at deep AI and shallow AI in a sense. So deep AI is you building large language models and got NVIDIA racks and things like that, whereas shallow AI is using ChatGPT. And so, if you're just using ChatGPT, there's investors, at least astute ones, are going to put relatively little value on that. And in fact, these days, HMRC don't even want to do R&D tax claims on AI products that are already content rather than technology. So I didn't answer the question. Of course, the question isn't hugely useful because if you just happen to be the founder that is obsessed with, a new golf course thing or whatever it is what it is. And then you need to find investors that will want to be in your space. You can try sites like shipshape.vc, which is an investor search directory. There are others to try and find investors for your space. And then it all comes to storytelling to entice investors after figuring out quite quickly if, don't waste your time and theirs if they only invest in one sector and you're in a different sector.
Awesome. Okay. I want to talk about how long founders should budget to fundraise, both for a first-time raise and also apart from the 18 months being the standard time between raises. I guess how many months left of runway should you have when you go out to fundraise again?
Okay. Obviously, that's a critical question. I think that, when you start your business, you're bootstrapping it yourself. So in a sense, your runway is infinite. It's at some point you get bored funding it yourself, or rather you limit the rate of hiring while you can afford it. So my SeedLegals data shows that founders put a median of £26,000 of their own money into the business. How do I know that? It's because when you do a funding round, you can say, I would like to turn the money I put into the business into a founder loan so it can get repaid later or it can get converted into equity. And so rather then that just being lost money, even though you may not get it back in the short term, you might agree that when the company becomes profitable or on a sale of the company, your loan money can be repaid. And by the amounts that people enter, I can see that's £26,000. So you start, of course, when you start, you meet in the pub, your cost of, the startup is zero. But of course, you're rate limited. You don't have a marketing person, you don't have a developer. So at some point, you start hiring people. Maybe it's on a no pay basis. We'll give you some equity. Can we do this for a while? But pretty soon, it starts becoming more serious. And now you start having real outgoings. At some point, it becomes a few £1,000s a month. Your spouse might notice, and you really need to raise investment. So in the early days, it's probably not so much about runway and going out of business. It's about sort of this hobby project just stopping and, or going on the slow burn. But once you really have hired a few people and they've given up their jobs elsewhere and worked for you, now the treadmill is going. So how long does it take to fundraise? I'd probably put that into two parts. One of them is I've got everything prepped, and now I need to find investors and fundraise. And there it might be on the order of, surprisingly, 4 to 6 months, the vast majority of which is going out and speed dating or dating investors and trying to organize, them all together to come on and leave on the bus at the same time. That can get much shorter if you're now using Seed Fast to raise opportunistically. But probably the longer part in an early startup is the bit where you think you're ready for fundraising, and then it turns out your deck's not quite ready and you don't have any materials. And then you have a couple of, meetings with investors, and you realize that you're woefully not there yet, or you haven't really worked out what it is that you want. So I think there's this initial period at the start where it's still like, I'm not sure we're doing this. I'm not sure we need to raise. And of course, if you can bootstrap it yourself, pay for it yourself, that's much better than raising, except that comes to an end because you are limited by the amount that you can personally spend on the startup. So at SeedLegals, my co-founder and I began funding it ourselves. And it was like a few £100s a month, and then a few thousand, and then 5,000, and then 10,000. It was like doubling every few months. So, okay, we need to stop this because it will bankrupt us. We need to go and fundraise. So, the time to fundraise is the point at which you can no longer afford to keep running or growing the business yourself, or that the rate of growth of the development, and that you can develop the product or market it, is held back by your ability to fundraise it. And then, in your mind, you think, the legals for the taking an investment are extremely fast. If you find an investor and they want to be in, you can get their money by like a week's time. But the hard bit is finding investors and finding which investors to go for. And I think here one of the problems is founders go initially, I don't know any investors. So where do I find investors? Well, I look up those investor directories. There are lots of them on SeedLegals or sites like ShipShape, but they all show you VCs. And VCs, as we know, only come along and invest typically once the company's got revenue and a product. There are early stage funds, SEIS funds like SFC, Hatch Ventures, and others that will come in much earlier. But one of the challenges, you go off and do some Googling, find VCs. If you manage to get a meeting with them, the story goes, love what you're doing, come back later. So really in the early stages, it's about raising from angel investors, individuals. And since everyone is an angel investor, I think the formula is to make as much noise on social, on LinkedIn, on Insta, wherever your following is. If you've got a following, let as many people know what you're doing. Don't make it spammy. Don't go offering a 5x return after 3 years, because you can't actually do that. I mean, you can't promise somebody something that may not work, but you can be passionate about what it is that you're building, a nice lifestyle image, work on new, golf putting thing with AI, stick, whatever it might be, going to change the way golf is done. You can see I've never actually played golf, but with a nice lifestyle picture, Let me know if you're interested. Here's the link to the pitch deck. I'd love to tell you more. And then you may find people interested in investing. You'll find people who are interested in partnering, people who will tell you about the competitor, people who will tell you they don't understand your pitch. So, you might call it building in public. And I quite like that approach. I like to often actually announce, obviously, you can't say something's built before you've built it because you'll be, embarrassed when people want it and you haven't built it. But you can say that you are building something and then see the reaction, or we're looking to, build this. I mean, if you're super early stage, you can talk about building this. And if it turns out nobody understands what it is that you want, then maybe you want to refine the messaging, or maybe think that is it solving a real problem as opposed to a perceived problem. I've gotten a bit off topic there, but yeah.
Okay, last question from me before we take questions from our founders. Can you share a little bit around typical documents that founders will be asked for by investors? I know this comes up so much in all the founder WhatsApp groups around like, hey, this investor just asked me for X, Y, and Z. Is that normal? Should I give it to them?
Great question. So I think my starting point is there are many different types of investors. So one of the key things when you talk to an investor is try and understand what's driving that investor. And I realized this when I was in the audience, and on stage were two investors, and somebody asked, how do you do valuation? And one of them said, well, I look at the business plan, I work out the net present value, I look at the market size, there's Sam, Tam, and Som, and I look at comparables and I do the arithmetic and I come up with a valuation. And if yours matches that, I'm in. And the other one went, well, if I like the founders and the valuation seems like not outrageous and I love the idea, I'm in. So you get vastly different drivers for investors, and your goal is to, understand what is driving that investor and tap into it. So some investors are going to, man, I love what you're doing. That's awesome. I'm in. And others are going to want, deep financials to the point. They're so onerous, you probably don't want them in your life at all because they'll drive you mental on an ongoing basis. But broadly, obviously, the investors are going to want to see investment agreements showing what they're going to get for their money, the shares agreement or the articles or the term sheet initially. They're also going to want to see, obviously, a nice pitch deck that sells them on the process. They're going to want to see a business plan to show that there's a plan for you to give them the return on their investment. Sometimes later stage investors are going to want to see what they call a data room, which is just anything from a G drive, or if you're doing a round on SeedLegals, we provide that. You upload a bunch of documents. So one of the things certainly later stage investors are going to want to see is that everyone who's worked on the project has got an IP assignment and an NDA, so that there's no dispute. Somebody who's leaving says, I own the IP, and then everything falls apart. They want to see that everyone's got employment agreements or founder agreements that have got share vesting. So if the founder leaves, they have to give some of their shares back again. So you've got these due diligence documents. And in the first round with an angel investor, you haven't employed people yet. So they might want to see those employment agreements or founder agreements, but it's probably fairly light touch. It might even be friends and family investors who don't know or don't care about this. But once you get to your seed round or your first VC round, those investors are really going to be checking that, and the round can fall apart if you don't have those due diligence. So, a few startups ago, before SeedLegals, when it came to my first round, an investor sent me their due diligence request. It took me like 3 weeks of riffling through my cupboard and shoe boxes trying to find these paper printouts. It was a nightmare. And my next startup, I was a bit more prepared. It took me about 3 days to ruffle around in my shoebox and inbox and so on to find things. But on SeedLegals, it's all there now. So when it came to SeedLegals, it was like, 3 minutes to go, save, 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 email, there you go. So you really want to make sure that every time you've employed somebody or hired a consultant, or the founders all have agreements so that when it comes to due diligence in your later rounds, you don't end up with a mad scramble to find somebody who no longer works for the company, who doesn't like you anymore, and try to get them to sign agreements and so on.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're going to move to Q&A. Conti, you are up first, and I'll take a question from the chat, and then Eddie, you'll go third. So Conti, go ahead and take yourself off mute and fire away. Oh no, you just disappeared. Okay.
No.
Eddie, did you have a question? Or was your hand raised?
I think it was an accidental hand raise.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Eddie, you're up.
You just bought the painting for 64 million. Oh, go on to Kanti. Okay, all right.
Yeah, so my question was just about sort of co-founder, equity, CTO titles, and sort of control. Like I've been working on this idea for a while, like a year, and then I've sort of gone full time and quit my job, and so obviously taken the plunge, but they're still very much working their jobs and are asking for big salaries to leave, which is, you know, very reasonable. They're very qualified technical people. I'm sort of technical-ish, but I don't want to be taken on the technical side. I want to be giving it over to them. And then we sort of had conversations with these two co-founders that are joining me, and they're doing like 5 hours a week now, sort of time on the side. But they're also like, what do I think about giving them equity? How much equity? Obviously, it'll vest. I've sort of said 30, 30, 40 so far, but like that also feels like a lot. And then there's sort of worry about control. Like if they ganged up on me now, they own more of it than me, or who do I give the CTO title to, or what other titles do I give out? Sorry, there's a lot. How to go about all that?
Cool. So I love your questions. Probably the most important question that every startup founder comes across. And usually your first, sometimes it's a couple of co-founders get together and one of them is the technical one and one not. Sometimes it's two non-technical founders or just a non-technical founder, and then you're going to bring in your CTO. So the CTO is usually, the first hire. And then how much equity should you give him or her? And here, let me tell you the brain dump from my side. So, because that's super important. So my starting point is to recognize, to me, there are two roles. You're either a founder or you're an employee. So a founder is someone who probably is paid a lot less than market salary, is maybe not paid anything up front, and is actually funding the company themselves. But the weight of the world and the success of your company is on your shoulders. So you can't go, I'm bored, I'm out of here. Like you're there to make it a success. Whereas an employee is somebody who's paid, substantially, maybe a bit less, but substantially market rate. And when they're not performing or when they get bored, they can leave or you can terminate them and the company continues happily without them. So once you've got these two concepts in mind, then you can start seeing where does somebody fit. So now when it comes to a CTO, you might say, if you can pay them market salary, then you don't need to give them any equity in theory. I mean, as a logical economic construct, if they're no better off going anywhere else than your company, you didn't need to give them equity, or any equity that you're giving them is a nice sweetener on top. So let's say your CTO would, be earning 80K a year, and you could be paying them 80K a year. Maybe you give them some amount of stock options so that they, are bought in. But as a practical matter, early stage, maybe you can't pay them anything for a while, and then you can pay them maybe 40K a year. So let's run this by way of example. So the first, let's say 6 months, they wouldn't get paid anything. So that if they were earning 80K a year, that's a 40K value. And then let's say for the next year, they might get paid half of their salary market rate, so 40K a year. So that's another 40K. So that's 80K that they would be sacrificing by joining your company. So let's say your company's valuation is £1 million, 80K is 8%. So you might think that just giving them 8% equity, as a compensation for their initially no and then lower salary makes sense. And indeed, the 5 to 10% for what I call a founding employee is generally about right, often that sort of CTO role. So if it's a co-founder getting together, you may have a more even equity split between you. But if you are hiring somebody that's really more like an employee until they've become a co-founder, then I think the sort of 5 to 10%. And there, what I always like to do is think of it, what is the equivalent in salary or money based on, I mean, it's the valuation's arbitrary, but that's going to be supremely helpful in all things. So let's say you want to hire a board advisor and they go, I want 6% equity. Well, 6% equity, if your valuation's £1 million, it's £60,000. That's insane. I'll give you £5,000 a year equity for being, one day a month or whatever we're helping me. So 5%, sorry, £5,000 out of £1 million is 0.5%. Vesting over a year sounds about right. So one more thing, which is I'm not a big fan of just welcoming somebody to the party and going, you're a co-founder. I think that's more of an earn thing. So your CTO, you really don't know whether you're going to gel with them at all. Maybe it's not going to work out. One of the problems if you hire someone as a CTO role often means they don't code themselves. Their goal is to build a team and mentor them and do thought leadership pieces and write articles. You don't want any of that stuff for now. When you're 100 people, you do. For now, you just want someone who's going to code. So if you tell someone they're a CTO, they may get a bit ahead of themselves. So what you really want is a tech lead or senior developer who can then graduate to that. So my suggestion, for example, in the case that you've got, you could go off and tell the person that maybe their role is CTO, but maybe actually the role that's being advertised is a tech lead to do the development and then build more of the team once you've got some investment, and then that can graduate to becoming CTO. And initially, you'll call them a founding employee, which stops short of founder. They get 5 to 10% equity. You're going to pay them maybe no money initially, and then a bit more, and then it may graduate from there. So it's a bit like finding a co-founder might be a bit like marriage. You're not just going to meet somebody and marry them. You want to do some dating first and make it more progressive towards that. And now I've gone on a completely wrong analogy, but still
just a quick
okay.
A quick follow on to that on the part-time that you do before, if they're doing like 5 hours a week or something before, how do you think about that in terms of before they get into founding?
Yeah, great point. So I would probably just think of it as a proportional thing. So you might say, by the way, this is quite standard, which is somebody has a day job, and then you've got a catch-22 where they're not going to give up their day job until you've got funding, and you can't get funding until they've given up their day job because investors don't want to invest in companies that have got people, doing part-time things. Where's their money going? If it's just a hobby for you, they will put their money elsewhere. So you might say, well, if you were full-time, I would be paying you, 80K a year and you would get 10% equity. If you're doing 2 days a week, then we're going to divide that by 5, and we're going to say that you're going to get this amount of equity now and more later. Or you might say, I'm going to give you 10% shares, but they're going to vest in some milestones. So you'll get a certain amount month by month, but once you go full-time, then you'll get more. And, if you hit the chat bubble on SeedLegals, with specific examples, my team hopefully can help with that, or you're welcome to message me directly, Anthony@seedlegals.com, or drop me a note on LinkedIn, and I can try and answer specifically on those points.
Thank you.
Juan, do you want to ask?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anthony. It's always a pleasure to see you. I don't know if you remember me, but of course I remember you. You are the wisdom in the startup scene, always. So yeah, thank you very much as well, everyone. And yeah, Anthony, I have a question. So when I'm doing my financials, everything makes sense. But I don't want it to make sense for me. I wanted to make it make sense for the angel investors. In your experience, can you give me like the 3 things that I should focus in my financials in order that investor says, okay, this is a good business, this is something I can invest on, and this is something like is worth it. So yeah, if you can give me like that advices, I will be very grateful. And thank you. Yeah.
So thanks for the kind words. It's a difficult challenge you've given me. I think, if you assume that people have got very limited time, we've seen probably all those stats that say investors look at a slide deck for 1 minute, 30 seconds and make up their minds in the first 38 seconds or something like that. I think, if you're an investor, you're thinking, well, as I said, that investors have got different drivers. Some of them want to see a return on investment. Some of them are just like, where's my SEIS? Some might want to save the planet and know that it's not a great investment on its own, but it's a do-good investment. But let's say you've got someone looking for a return on investment. So the next thing is that angel investors think differently to VCs. So VC might do 20 investments from their fund, and they know there's a power law that says one of those investments will return 50x, 3 of them will return 5x, and the others will return 1x or lose money. And so they're looking for each of their investments to be a unicorn. And so they're looking for numbers that will be stratospheric after some years. An angel investor is different. They might do 3 investments a year. So for them, if 1 in 20 is a winner, that's no good at all. They're going to lose all their money before they get to a winner. So for an angel investor, if they can get a 3x or 5x return on their investment after a few years, that's awesome. That's much better than the bank will return. So you're going to have your business plan, in mind for your target audience. So let's say you're going and raising from angel investors. Yeah, I think if they see that the business has got a revenue of 10 to 20 billion pounds a year by year 5, that sounds like a good ballpark. If a multiplier is 5x to 10x on a valuation, if you're doing 20 million pounds a year revenue, that might be 150 or 200 million pounds valuation. And if you're selling your business for 200 million and they've invested for a few million, that's a huge multiple for them. So they're delighted, even if you're just doing 10 or 20 million pounds, if just 10 or 20 million pounds a year revenue, but that's an achievable amount. So what you want to do is you want your business plan to show a path to getting there. And that means, to me, if I'm looking as an investor, I want to see the business is, firstly, it's a great product that's going to be pitched in a way that is sensible and attractive to people. It's going to solve a problem that people have. That's, to me, the most important thing. Then I want to see that it can be delivered in a scalable way, that you're not losing money on each sale. So I might want to ultimately think about how you're going to acquire customers. Will it be them telling their friends, or will you have to spend lots of money on expensive pay-per-click advertising? And then I want to certainly if it's a hardware product, I want to see the gross margin and so on. But if it's software, I'm going to assume if it's some sort of SaaS thing that it will scale quite rapidly. And then ultimately, going back to what I said earlier, I'm probably going to look at the business plan and see the year-on-year growth, knowing that you made up those numbers. But it's a good idea of your ambition. If you're only getting to £1 million a year after several years, that's great. Great business for you, nice, salary, but not attractive for an investor. And if it's too crazy growth, then I'm just not going to believe your numbers. So I think really for an investor, where I'm going is, it's probably quite a simple formula. They just want to see, does this look like a growing business with a good exit in 5 years or thereabout? You can't never promise someone an exit. But that's really how they make their money. You're going to get acquired, sell the business at a valuation that gives them, at least a 5x return on investment. And I think that's if an angel investor, and a lot more if it's a VC. I hope that helped.
Great. Sophia.
Hi, Anthony. Great to see you again. My question is, again, it's back to CTO situation. We had a very high profile CTO at the beginning, who was like a celebrity, and we gave him 33%. Us is me and my other partner, non-technical co-founders, who were there at the beginning, about 6-7 months ago it started. So our CTO was so big for us, he didn't perform and we had to fire him, and he agreed to return of his shares, 33%. So this new potential CTO we met. He has a team in Ukraine, and he seems like a really nice guy. We really like him, and we wanted to offer him like a good salary once we raise funds, and then offer him maybe 1%, up 1 to 5% of equity, and the position of CTO, not just hire him as a development company. But he said he wants 34%, just like the previous one. He obviously never put any money into the project. He's not going to develop MVP for free. He's not going to do any coding. He just wants, he explains it because it's a technical company. That's basically what it's worth. So I don't know if it's fair or not. What's your opinion on that?
It's a great point. So I think that, you did exactly the classic thing, which is, CTO treat as, marriage partner doesn't work. I'm delighted that they were gracious and said they didn't want to keep the equity. Otherwise, it could have been quite messy. And now the question is kind of having made it, one experience, do you want to repeat? I think that it's obviously a very difficult question to answer because it may turn out this person is brilliant and delivering exactly what you want. And of course, being a founder means making decisions and taking brave steps. And if you never make a brave step, you never get anywhere. But having had one experience with something, the CTO with lots of equity that didn't work out, are you ready for the same? I think the short answer, obviously, I can't just give advice, throwaway advice in seconds for like the future of your company. But my take is, if you think that they would be a co-founder that you can get together and brainstorm things, and they're going to contribute as an equal founder to the really big questions in the company. We built it, nobody's coming, we need to pivot, what do we do? What's the core market? What do consumers really want? It's not about building stuff, it's about creating solutions to what people really want. And if you think he's really part of that as a co-founder, then that equity percent might be right. If on the other hand, really you think of it as an outsourced operation, and at some point you're going to switch to something else, maybe you find that working with people remotely, I think remote work works well if you know exactly what you want. You write a spec and somebody builds it. But in an early stage, you don't know what you want. You're waiting for customers to tell you. You're making stuff up as you go along, and they bring people together internally, even if they are these days hybrid working, is critical. So I don't know the answer. I think the only thing is if you force, to say I have to binary go with this or not, you might say, all right, I'll give you 32%, but it comes with a vesting profile that creates some milestones so that if things don't work out, they don't get it, they get 3% now, and then they get more later on, so that they're seen, they're delighted to get the 32%. But if you model in your mind what happens if it doesn't work out and you terminate in 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, what would be something that you would both think was actually a fine, solution? So if they put a lot of effort in and deliver something and you terminate in 6 months, maybe it's just fine. They got 4% equity, but they shouldn't have 32% at that point. So I hope there's enough info there to answer that question.
But do we actually need a CTO? Because we already done so much work. Now we come to that point, we create an MVP. Do we need CTO on the pitch deck? Is it going to help us to raise funds? Because he thinks he's an integral part, and that's why he wants 33%. But we're not sure. We created all the product before he even stepped in. We've been working on it so hard. We have everything like ready to go. We can hire somebody else who can create MVP for us. He's a really nice guy. I like him though.
Yeah, great point. So one of the classic problems as founders you come across are people in your team who, think they're indispensable. Which is great because it gets them to contribute, but at some point it crosses over to being painful, and the person is just trying to, like a baby, scream too much for attention, and then it becomes counterproductive. It sounds to me that you want to gently, without putting them down, explain that, in your investor meetings, this is your deck and it doesn't show CTO, and investors aren't complaining, or it shows a CTO as an employee. and actually you've built it. So you want to see how you can, I think, reset their expectations without getting them to go away, but without giving them so much of the company that clearly you've expressed discomfort on that.
Thank
All
you.
right, I have to run in 4 minutes. Let's take a couple of quick fire questions.
Try and get through everything really fast. So Daniel.
Thanks, Anthony. Morning. Just following up on Sophia's point, if I have 100% of my company, if I found a co-founder type person who wanted to join in, how would you advise them to join my company, I guess? What should I or what should they be asking for to come on board as co-founder? Yeah, equity package, that's
okay. So here's the way. I mean, it's a real problem, right? I mean, you've spent time. This is your idea. You've got 100%. Then someone comes along. Do you want to give them 50%, 2%? There's no obvious answer. But the way I like to think of it is jump forward 5 years. So it's now the year 2028. Your business is, let's say, 50 people or something like that. You put insane number of hours in over the years. And looking back looking in 2028, what do you think might be a reasonable equity split between you? And it may turn out that the fact you put 6 months into it so far as a side hobby was definitive, or actually maybe that only counts for like 5% in the scheme of things. So if you think that you are contributing equal amounts going forward, then you might have some starting amount to represent the work you put in so far. And so maybe it turns out that it's like, 55, 45% split because you think in 5 years, or maybe you're not so sure from their character that you'll still be together. And it's actually, they are late joining. You think it's largely you think you may need another co-founder. So you are not going to give them that much. But whichever way you go for, I mean, the problem when you give equity, you are making a forward bet that you don't know how it's going to work out. And so it's a big bet. And the way you mitigate the risk somewhat is with share vesting. So you could set some milestones, or it could vest over 3 years. So if it's not working out, but I can't think of a better way than trying to mentally game where, if you were to look back in 5 years' time, go, that was great that we're 50-50, or bastard, the other person isn't performing at all. I'm putting my heart and life into this business and they're slacking, and more like 10% would have been the go. So if you are able to think through into your future self, and then that might, obviously it's a tricky problem to have, but that's the best answer I can think of for that.
all right. Thank you.
We've probably got about 30 seconds remaining. So Laila, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I want to ask about individual funding. You mentioned that I can ask for it before the funding round. I am an artist, so I think the first person I would ask is my previous collectors, that they would be interested for me to build my immersive art experience. And then I want to ask you, what is the promise I can give them? Shall I say, like, in 6 months I will return them the money, or what will they get from this if I have 6 months if I can raise the money from them? What's the promise I can give to them?
Okay, so it's obviously slightly atypical, right? So it's not a platform. This is really about you doing some work yourself, and now you need funding for it. So if we take a step back, there are 2 ways of getting funding broadly. One of them is equity investment. So investor gives you money and you give them shares. Or the other traditional way is a loan. A bank lends you money and you have to repay it later. I'm always cautious about mixing the 2. So if you're looking to raise investment is usually or generally not repaid. The investor gets shares, a share in your business. And if you sell the business later, they get, hopefully a multiple of their money back again, but they don't get repaid. And certainly if they're investing and getting their SEIS discounts, any repayment scheme will invalidate their SEIS. So I think what you want to do is put this in one of two categories. Either they're going to invest and they get 1% of the business and 1% of the upside later. And the way they get their money back is when you sell the company, or if you're paying dividends. If you're not planning to sell the company, as you sell artworks or whatever, the company starts paying dividends and they get a share of dividends. Or it's a loan and they're loaning you money and you're going to repay it. The challenge with a loan, of course, is you should only borrow money when you've got the cash flow to repay it. Otherwise, you'll go bankrupt. So if you are sure that you can service the debt, then you can repay it. But startups build products that takes longer to find customers. So generally, as a startup, firstly, a bank won't lend you money because you've got no revenue to repay it. And secondly, you shouldn't borrow money unless you know that you're going to have the cash flow to repay, or you will be bankrupt. So, it seems to me the first question is the business you've got suitable for investment, or is it really a loan or some other, or maybe you pre-selling an artwork, they're giving you money now and you have to deliver the artwork or repay the money. There are many different things you can explore, and turning it into a growth type startup might be perfect, but it doesn't have to be the only way.
Thank you.
All
Well, I'll
right,
jump
now,
in
Mike.
because I know we're over time and you probably have to run.
Yes, unfortunately, do feel free to drop me a note on LinkedIn. I will try to respond, or drop me a note, Anthony@SeedLegals.com. I'm sorry, my team didn't spot that this was a hotbed event booked in a product call right after. So I need to
sorry. No problem. Thanks so much, Anthony. Founder sticker.
Just a quick, if it's possible, I was one of the first customer of SeedLegals, so just to recommend Anthony and SeedLegals to everyone and say hello to Anthony. Ciao, Anthony.
That is so kind, Mario. I remember Mario from when I was literally sitting on a beanbag at person number, where SeedLegals was 4 people and I was doing sales and marketing and product. So thanks, Mario, for the kind words. All right. Thank you, everyone. And please hit me up with any questions afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.